What happens when you make a quilt by quilting your quilt blocks before adding any backing fabric? About 10 years ago now, my daughter Connor, my mother-in-law Sue, and I all got together to give it a try. Hi, I'm Beth Williams, quilting instructor, designer, and longtime fan of creative, accessible techniques. And if you've ever been curious about the Quilt-As-You-Go method made popular by Jera Brandvig in her book, Quilt-As-You-Go Made Modern, especially how the process works and how well the quilts hold up over time, this video is for you. And if you'd like to try this method, I'll share my best tips and recommendations as well as cautions at the end. But first, let's do a quick recap of how these techniques differ from traditional quilting methods. Typically, we quilters sew together a quilt top or flimsy, and if we're going to quilt it ourselves, we layer the quilt top with batting and a backing fabric and pin baste, or we fuse the layers together with basting spray or fusible batting so that our quilting stitches will go through all 3 layers at the same time. Quick side note, if you're interested in either of those methods, I do have videos for you. But now back to business. Once the layers are basted, it's time to quilt. This can be the most challenging part of the whole process. Hand quilting is lovely, but it simply takes too much time for most of us, and some of us too much finger dexterity and strength. Quilting by machine is a wonderful alternative, but it does pose the additional challenge of feeding the bulk of the quilt through the sewing machine while still giving yourself enough slack to be able to stitch freely. There are tips and tricks that can help with this process, but the bigger the quilt, the more challenging it will always be. With Jera's method, you piece or sew the blocks directly onto each batting square. This quilts the block, attaching the fabric to the batting, but the initial stitching does not show on the front of the block. Then you can add additional quilting that you'd like to add to each block. This stitching will show, so it's a fun way to do something creative, whether it's rows of wavy lines, free motion patterning, or straight lines. The blocks are super easy to handle, even when quilted quite densely. Once quilted, the blocks are trimmed to size and joined. One way to do this is by sewing them right sides together and trimming or tapering the ends of the seam allowances near the intersections to reduce bulk and pressing the seam allowances open. Here's a closer look at our 2 blocks that have been joined and how the seam allowances have been tapered at the ends and pressed open. And here's a close-up of the finished quilt. As you can see, there's no noticeable lumps or ridges where the blocks are joined. Everything flattened out nicely. Here are blocks from another pattern from the Quilt-As-You-Go Made Modern book, Rainy Days. These blocks are pieced directly onto the batting, with each piece quilted before adding the next. And here's a complete quilted block, ready to assemble into a quilt. And here's a close-up of the finished quilt. Isn't it fun? I also made the Queen Anne steps pattern from the book. Jera suggests making the piecing purposely wonky instead of straight, but as you can see, this block is only a little wonky. Here's the view from the back. I did have a lot of fun adding some freeform curvy quilting. And here's a close-up of the finished quilt. Another fun pattern included in the book is Red Square, a wonky log cabin. Here are 3 of the blocks my mother-in-law made, shown here after trimming to size. And here are 2 of the blocks sewn together with a joining strip method. The seam allowances don't need to be trimmed or tapered, and the seams don't need to be pressed open. Switching gears, one of the things I love about Jera's approach is that it's adaptable to a huge variety of quilt patterns. In addition to making several of the patterns in the book, I tried applying the same techniques to the Talk of the Town pattern by Amy Ellis. Here's my stack of blocks, layered with batting, but no backing fabric yet. After quilting each block separately, I trimmed them all to the same size. This is what the rows of quilted blocks look like with joining strips between the blocks in each row. And here's a close-up of what they look like after I sewed the quilted rows together with additional joining strips. Here's a close-up of the back of the quilt. You can see that the joining strips eliminate any concern about bulk at the intersections. Each quilted block butts up against the adjacent blocks with no overlap. Here I'm getting ready to add the backing fabric to the completely assembled and quilted quilt top and batting. Instead of stitching in the ditch along the joining strips, I chose to stitch on top of the seams with the same decorative stitch that I used when quilting the individual blocks. This worked really well for me. But if you're using a walking foot, you may need to select a decorative stitch that only goes forward instead of back and forth, because your walking foot might not like that. Now let's look at some of the advantages of the Quilt-As-You-Go Made Modern method. First of all, it's much easier to quilt individual blocks than a large quilt. Turning and rotating is simple and easy, which gives those of us working on home or domestic sewing machines much more creative freedom. We can use our choice of walking foot or free motion techniques without worrying about the logistics of maneuvering a full quilt through the sewing machine. And unlike many, although not all, common quilt-as-you-go methods, no hand stitching is needed to join the quilted blocks. It's a fast, beginner-friendly, and physically easier on the body method. You're not dealing with the full bulk of the quilt until the very end. Fantastic, right? Not so fast. Let's look at the potential downsides. Will the intersections where the blocks come together feel bulky or uneven? The answer? Sometimes they might. Trimming the seam allowances close to the intersections does help a lot, and joining strips help even more. Won't the backing sag? Yep, maybe a little bit. Not so much that it's a structural integrity issue. The backing isn't really pulling away from the quilt. It's just a bit wrinkly, even if a walking foot was used for the final quilting. Here's a close-up of the back of my now about 10 years old Rainy Days quilt. The back isn't really sagging, but it does look significantly looser than the fabric on the front of the quilt, which does make perfect sense if you think about it. As the quilt has been used and laundered, the dense quilting on the front of the quilt has helped compress the fabric on the front of the quilt into the batting, causing the top of the quilt to functionally shrink a little bit in comparison to the back of the quilt. And here's the back of my blue quilt, also about 10 years old now. As with the previous quilt, you can see the imprint of the thicker than usual seam allowances on the back of the quilt. This backing fabric also looks a little bit loose, but not as much as the previous example, because the individual blocks weren't quilted as densely, so the front of the quilt hasn't been compressed as much. And here's a peek at the back of my Talk of the Town quilt. Again, the backing fabric looks a little bit loose, but in all these cases, it isn't actually loose or sagging or pulling away from the batting. It's just a little bit looser and has extra crinkles in it. When you look at the back of the finished quilts, the quilting looks rather sparse in comparison to the front of the quilt. Some folks deal with this by adding more quilting at the end, but I chose to stick with the original technique, minimizing how much quilting is done on the fully assembled quilt. back to potential concerns. How well will the quilt hold up over time? I can happily give a positive answer to this one. Just great. As I've mentioned before, my human family members are camera shy, so I'll let the kitties show you how well loved and well used these quilts are. And in case you may be wondering, yes, those are indeed my toes at the top of the photo. Here's Ronan huddled up in one of these quilts as a baby. And here he is a few years later. There's nothing like a quilt for a nice nap, is there? These quilts have been in regular use by kids, adults, and fur babies, and have been through many wash and dry cycles. I think they've held up really well. Here's a roundup of my favorite tips for this method. First, I feel that it works best for quilt blocks that are 12 inches or smaller in size, especially if you're worried about potentially saggy backing fabric. Use a sturdy, low-loft, needle-punched batting. As Jera points out, needle-punched batting tends to be more dense and stable, with less warping or stretching as you work than a batting bonded with resin or glue. Stick with a cotton or cotton blend batting. A polyester or cotton poly blend with too much poly may melt slightly when or if you need to press seams open. And more tips? My daughter and I found that unless we would lose an important part of the design, for example the point on a half square triangle, we preferred to join our blocks with 3/8 inch seams instead of 1/4 inch seams when joining blocks by the direct method. This made it significantly easier to press the seams open. We also found that we appreciated the option of top stitching about 1/8 of an inch on either side of the seam instead of trying to consistently stay in the ditch when adding the backing fabric to the assembled quilt blocks. This helped flatten the seam allowances and helped us avoid stitching through seams that had been pressed open. My conclusion? These quilts may not be show ready. That is, I wouldn't enter quilts made with these techniques into judged competitions where judges have to nitpick over every detail. However, if you're looking to make quilts for you and your loved ones to use and enjoy, this may be a technique you'll find helpful. Have you ever tried Quilt-As-You-Go before? Do you think you'll try it in the future? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear about it.